It's my groot plesier om vandag te praat met Damon Galgut oor sy nuwe boek, The Promise, wat pas verskyn het en besig is om opslae te maak internasionaal. Damon, I want to ask you immediately, this is the third time that you're being nominated for the Booker Award. Any feelings about that? Let's get that out of the way.
Well, of course I have feelings about it, but they're complicated and contradictory. It's very nice. You know, books are in such a state in the world at the moment right now that it very often takes a prize listing to bring them to attention. So whatever one may say about prizes, they do help books along.
They do help
a cause I believe in, yeah.
Yeah. Indeed. As a matter of fact, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned something that it's quite difficult publishing during COVID as well.
Well, I think it's complicated. I was lucky enough to finish this book just before COVID hit and to get it sold to a publisher, but I think it would have been far more complicated if I'd been circulating it once, you know, lockdown had started, just because everybody felt the world was upside down, the old rules didn't apply, and nobody was being very decisive about anything. So, of course, books are still being read and published, but the world has become a far more cautious place, yeah.
Indeed. You got absolutely astounding critical reaction. As far as I go, there's maybe one or two critics that hedge a little, but I'll get to that later. But it's been astonishing, the reaction to this particular novel.
Is that a question?
That's a question.
Well, I'm astonished, to be honest, because, you know, for reasons that maybe we can get into later, I felt very insecure during the writing of the book, and I wasn't sure if on the most basic level of readability that it was working. So, you know, I'm gratified, like most writers are, to get a good response at all, but you're right, I've had some extremely good critical reviews, and of course I'm nothing but grateful, surprised and appreciative.
I want to say that there's been a huge gap between the previous novel, which was Arctic Summer, and this one. There was a 10-year gap.
7 years.
7 years. Why this long silence?
Well, Marthinus, you've known me long enough to know that that's not unusual for me. I take a very long time to find what it is I want to engage with next. There was a slightly longer gap in this case because of COVID. The book could have come out, you know, maybe 6 or 8 months before it actually did, but, you know, everyone, as I say, is being extra cautious at the moment. So. Yeah. Everything tends to get pushed back. But, you know, I take a long time to decide what it is I want to commit myself to next, because a book is not a small thing. It's sort of like, in a certain sense, a relationship that you enter into. So you really have to commit yourself. You have to be absolutely sure that this is something you want to spend the next 3 or 4 years of your life doing.
I wanted to ask, it takes about 4 years for you to finish a novel.
Yeah, huh? I'm slow. Slower than some. I mean, there are writers who can produce a book a year, and I envy those people, but I don't have that facility.
So jy moet in werklikheid dan gaan en vir jou 'n baie pertinente idee kry waarmee jy kan saamleef intens.
For me, it's about self-expression. So I need to engage with an idea that I feel in some way speaks for me at this point in my life. So in this case, there's a kind of underlying subject to every book, which is perhaps not apparent in the book itself or to the readers of the book, but in this case, what matters most to me at this point in my life is the passage of time passing. You know, I'm nearly 60. Amazing fact. But, I mean, amazing to me, not to anyone else. But what preoccupies me more and more is my own mortality, the fact that, you know, the greater part of my life is behind me. And that, for me, is the real subject of this book. Beneath the politics, beneath South Africa, even the characters, it's the question of time passing and what does that do to me, to politics, to the, you know, to the nation, to the landscape. It's that I was trying to register. So the right idea came as a vehicle to give expression to that.
Damon, I want to ask you about becoming a writer. It's such a solitary journey, certainly. And you started at a very, very young age. You were 17 when you published your first novel, A Sinless Season. How did that come about, and why did you decide on this very solitary road?
It sort of feels like it decided on me in a way. You know, I've spoken about this in interviews before, but in a way, it's an unanswerable question. Why would anyone want to spend their time making up stories about people who don't actually exist? I mean, I surmise that my connection with books and writing began when I was ill as a young child. I mean, I had lymphoma when I was 6. I had 5 years of chemotherapy, and I spent a lot of time in hospital or in sick beds being read to by people. And I think on a very sort of basic level, I associated stories with comfort, consolation, and attention on me, I guess. So I formed an obsession with books and the kind of worlds that they opened up really, really young. And from there, just, I don't know, it grew into a desire to make them myself. So, in fact, prior to my first book, I'd already written 2 novels at high school. I mean, very bad novels, sort of imitations of The Lord of the Rings and Wilbur Smith all mashed up together, which thankfully have never seen the light of day. But I gave that first book, Sinless Season, to an English teacher who I was close to at school. And she was sort of taken by it sufficiently to send it out to a publisher who then, I mean, Jonathan Ball Publishers, responded very positively to it, and I was sort of underway before I knew it was happening. And in a certain way, it's probably an advantage to begin so young because I had no idea how difficult this is. In a certain sense, it's become more difficult as I've gone along. It's easier when you're younger because you simply don't doubt yourself. Whereas as you get older, you doubt yourself more and more. And every time you do it, it becomes that much more difficult because you're trying to replicate maybe a success you had in the past and so on. So, you know, the notion that writing gets easier as you go along is just not true.
You became a resident writer. Was it still packed, or was it already the State Theatre company?
Well, when I started out, at more or less the same time that that first book came out, my first play was put on at what was then called PACT, Performing Arts Council of the Transvaal. So I was a little bit torn in myself about whether I wanted to become a playwright or a novelist. And I thought I'd answer that question ultimately by coming to drama school here, which had the salutary effect of putting me off playwriting forever, but that was probably a good thing. But yeah, I was given this, you laugh as one who knows.
I know.
Yes.
I know exactly what you mean.
But yeah, I was given this position of resident playwright at PACT, which was, you know, very generous of them and very helpful to me. But that feels like a very long time ago by now.
Ja. Nou, Damon, in terme van die ontwikkeling van jou werk, daar's vir my, ek dink ek het alles van jou gelees, behalwe miskien essays, ek weet nie of daar bestaan nie, maar wat daar is in boekvorm, het ek alles gelees. Daar's vir my so 'n paar quantum spronge gewees, where I thought you were moving along with leaps and bounds, sort of real, like, you know, plateaus, the new plateau and the new escarpment. And so the first one for me that really felt like a leap into a completely new area was In a Strange Room, in which you feature as well as I don't know to what extent as a fabricated character, maar dit is die een waar ek gevoel het, hierso kry ek 'n grensverskuivende kwaliteit in jou werk. Why and how?
That book emerged from probably the lowest point in my creative life, where I could not find publishers. My overseas publishers had dropped me. And in a way that's sort of helpful because you're not trying to play to a market. You're actually just falling back on yourself and what you might have to offer. So that book, I have to think back to a much earlier period. it came out of 3 particular journeys that I'd made, and I'd been telling these stories to people over and over, and the telling of the stories made me conscious of how I was remembering the journey. So I do recall that I sat down to start writing that book in a frame of mind that was not geared towards publication. I thought maybe this is something I'm going to write for myself. And I started writing it in the third person, and then I suddenly switched to the first, and I saw the possibilities that were opened up by this switch. So I'm not expressing this very well, but often with writing, the process begins unconsciously. You don't know why you make a particular choice, but your instinct sort of takes you there. And that was a moment like that. And then the writing itself becomes a process of lifting up into consciousness why you're approaching this thing this way. So it's really only at the end of the book that it made sense to me why I was switching between first and third person. And the reason, I mean, if it's of any interest, was that, again, the submerged subject there for me was memory. How does memory work? And in memory, one is a first person and a third person. Sometimes you're sort of outside yourself, looking at yourself as a he or a she. And at other moments, you're right back there in that instant, engaging with how it felt, and then you're very much an I. So, you know, that shift between he and I might not make logical sense, but it makes a kind of emotional, visceral sense. And I think that's how people received it. People understand that that's how you remember your life. So, yeah, I work sort of from unconsciousness and obscurity, hopefully to a kind of clarity. That's the arc.
And Damon, in A Strange Room, sort of based around several journeys, en jy het wyd gereis in jou lewe. Jy het groot dele van Suid-Amerika gedek vir 'n geruime tyd. Jy's deur Afrika. Jy het ook ongelooflik baie tyd in Indië deurgebring. Waarom hierdie spesifieke plekke en hoe vind hulle pad terug in jou skryfwerk? Want ek sien tog dat hulle doen.
Yeah, in a way, that's an earlier period now. I mean, my traveling these days seems to be book-related. And, you know, I own a flat in Cape Town, and that tends to make one more sedentary. I don't think traveling in my case was ever a very happy experience. There was a certain restlessness and unhappiness that drove it. Why I chose particular countries? Well, one is curious about some places and less so about others. But it sort of belongs to a time in my life where I was, I suppose, looking for a center and kind of rolling about, trying to find a groove that I fitted into. And I guess I gave some expression to that in A Strange Room, the restlessness, I mean.
Yeah. And India in particular, has that got a specific resonance? Because it does sort of find its way into Arctic summer, which really falls out of, I mean, superficially, seems to fall out of your normal landscape. I mean, I want to talk about that one as well because of the fact it had fantastic reviews, and yet it seemed to be a sort of a subdued area in terms of your writing. Do people look at you as an African writer, as a South Afrikaanse skrywer? Are you allowed to write about an existing historical figure and another writer? Where did that lead, and where does that come from, and how much of India actually finds its way into that?
Well, India was a bit of a surprise to me. I mean, I had a sort of yearning to go there for quite a long time, probably because I remember as a child my mother teaching yoga classes. And sort of from back then, I had this fantasy about India and yoga, and I sort of took up yoga myself. And my first impulse when I went to India was that I wanted to go to the Iyengar Yoga Institute. That didn't work out, but I found myself sort of wandering around. And India was unusual for me in the sense that I visited a lot of other places and never really felt the desire to go back there. I felt as if I'd seen those places, but when I approached India, I thought, okay, well, that's it. I'm going for one visit and I don't need to come back. But in fact, it's drawn me back and back and back over the years, to the extent that I think I've spent several years of my life there. And if one has an other place, India has been that for me. I even thought at one point of going to live there. But that sort of led me in a kind of inevitable and natural way, I hope, to the writing of Arctic Summer, when I had the idea of, looking at E.M. Forster and the 12 years, I think, it took him to write Passage to India. And yes, I thought, well, this might be a way to break out of the South African mold, and maybe Europeans would see me as a more international figure. And in fact, I think I came up against a certain resistance. You quite rightly talk about as a subdued register. And I think, perhaps it's just the book didn't reach the critical heights that others of mine might have. But I also think the English have a kind of innate resistance to people from other places coming and appropriating their cultural figures.
So, I was wondering about that.
Yeah, I mean, they would never say that, but that was my sense, that, you can't really understand an Englishman because you're from one of the ex-colonies out on the edge, Yes. Perhaps not as harshly as that.
Nee, hulle is baie goed met dit.
Ja.
Uitstekend. But I love that novel. I also thought that was a quantum leap.
Well, it gave expression to, I suppose, a number of things, again, that were happening in my life. I mean, the book, absolutely everything in there was factually researched and is about Forster, but there are certain overlaps between his life and mine. I mean, not 100%, but I did feel able to speak for myself to a certain extent through him and through his life, specifically about, sexuality. He was terrified of ever revealing himself. And I think he only ever did when he was far from home. So it was in Egypt or India that he actually kind of lived out his emotions, specifically because his mother was not present, incidentally, which is a sort of inhibiting factor for a lot of gay men, I think. But yeah, less so for me and less so for these times. But nevertheless, however much the world has progressed, I still don't think it's easy for a lot of young gay people to announce themselves. So Forster's timidity and his fear are still relevant and resonant for a lot of people.
Maar een van die goed wat ek ongelooflik baie in al jou werk geniet, is dat jou enige sake om seksualiteit hanteer jy ongelooflik delikaat en om met 'n ompad en fyn en baie keer met spanninge tussen mense. The Good Doctor, for instance, which is another one that I adore. That the tension is palpable, yet it never manifests. It's never really spoken about. That I find so lovely in the way in which you do so. I've never felt that you're an over gay writer, for instance, though there might be a gay sensibility.
Well, I think other people maybe cover that far better than I can. I'm quite fascinated. Look, the conventional notion of a plot is that somebody does something which sets something in motion. It's decisive. I'm sort of fascinated by what happens if people don't act. What happens if you don't do the thing you're supposed to do at a particular moment? Because it also sets things in motion, right?
Absolutely.
So it's a sort of unplot in a way. It's a sort of shadow plot. Now, that's a territory not a lot of people cover. So I'm far more interested in a relationship that should be something else but has failed to be, and yet still is a relationship. I mean, all the kind of unspoken, submerged things are still there. So those tensions fascinate me.
They also add texture. I get very bored with people who write about sex because it's limiting in many respects. It makes me feel uncomfortable. I've stopped reading certain novels because it becomes a grind in more ways than one.
There are only so many ways you can describe a sexual act, whereas there are probably infinite ways you can describe a sexual act that was meant to take place but hasn't.
Exactly.
Yeah, the tension sort of
adds so
spread.
much more texture and depth, and it opens up different avenues, and that I find exceedingly compelling in your work. I have to mention Mr. Edmund White, who, as a matter of fact, has said that not only that you are one of the world's great writers at the moment, which is fantastic, and then he uses this sentence, which is, he says that The Promise is the most important book of the last 10 years. That is quite a statement. So I want to start from really basic premise. In terms of writing, This is something that pours from your brain and from your hand. In Edmund White's biography on Jean Genet, he mentions something, I reread it recently, something extraordinarily beautiful. He said that Genet could not imagine a machine in the shape of a typewriter slipping between his hand and his head. How do you write? Are you one of those people who sit behind a word processor and so forth? How do you approach writing?
No, I write by hand, partly because I just have a kind of fetishistic love of stationery. I get excited by ink and, pen nibs and so on. But also, in a much more immediate and sensual way, I love the connection, the direct connection between my brain and the word. So if I'm working by hand, it feels to me as if that connection is physically there. I can see the connection between my thought and what I'm setting down on the page. If you're working on a screen, you're doing something over here and something's happening over there. There's a disconnect. The other thing is that actually, it takes me longer to write by hand than it takes me to type. I type quite fast.
So you have time to
Gives
think.
me an extra few seconds. And, few seconds might sound like nothing, but it makes a big difference. You have to consider the word you're putting down and what the next word is and how they relate and so on. So, novels are an art form that rely on time maybe much more than others. It's sort of what's most difficult about it in a way, but it's also what's most interesting to me. And they're also received in the same way, incidentally, because you can't, well, there are some books you can read in one sitting, but usually you invest a few days in that, and things are happening in your life. There's a kind of a process that's unfolding. That's magnified if you're the writer. You're spending years of your life writing this. You're not the same person you were when you finish as when you began. So, time is a factor. It's not visible maybe, but it's a factor in the creation, and that's kind of important.
And then do you write in a single line, and how do you go about correcting, or do you leave space then? Or
It's a total mess. I mean, my manuscripts are full of arrows and moving around and, crossings out and so on. Which, incidentally, I like. I mean, I like to go back over old manuscripts and look at them and see what a total mess they were. And it's sort of reassuring to me when I look back that I struggle with exactly the same things every time. Now, all of that's erased on the computer. You just get, your final draft. It's all clean and clear. And you forget what you went through, which is very often a very circuitous and laborious journey full of, despair. But it's there on the page. And I like that. I like the mess of it, basically.
And are you a disciplined writer, like, for instance, Somerset Maugham, who got up in the morning, sat down, wrote till 1 o'clock, and then...
No. In my fantasies, I'm that person, but in reality, I'm all over the place. So I need to work myself up to writing, and very often I only get to it in the evening. I spend a whole day sort of circling around. Writing's very good for all those household tasks that you don't otherwise attend to. I would rather do almost anything than sit down and write. So if you need to repair something in the kitchen, if you need to write a book, you'd rather do the repair, So I do a lot of circling around and tearing my hair out.
But you do distill. I mean, I always find with your work, it seems to me like it's inevitable. What ends up on the page, finally, to me, feels very inevitable.
Yeah, but if you had to look at what I end up with, I mean, my first draft is a total mess, much bigger and baggier than the final result. The real pleasure for me in writing is in those last stages when you are distilling. In other words, you've got this big mess and you need to reduce and find what's essential. There's a real pleasure in the essential. So, you get a big, flabby, obese body, and you need to bring it down to a skeleton, basically. And for me, there's a lot of pleasure in that. Removing repetition, removing excess. There's a real, again, sensual pleasure in bringing things down to their core.
Nou, vanoggend het ek die laaste hoofstuk weer gelees van The Promise, net om myself weer te verfris. En iets wat ek nie helemaal opgetel het die eerste keer is net dat die novel wat Anton skryf mimics the structure of this novel. And it's left half finished and ends up in disarray. I love rereading stuff. Some novels I've reread 12 times. But that I didn't pick up the first time. So, I mean, one tends to not pick up all these glorious little patterns that you embed in this. In approaching something like this, there's sort of 4 layers of individuals with a pseudo-family in terms of the workers, and then you have the religious, the glorious sort of movement in terms of the religion, starting with a woman who reverts to Judaism, and then the Dutch Reformed, and then the Baptist-style New Age, and ends with New Age. So you've got that layer, and then you've got the political layer. So how did you sandwich these 4 layers together so brilliantly and gloriously?
You know, books evolve. They don't arrive fully formed. They develop and accumulate. So you get one idea. I had an initial idea, actually, from a conversation with you, which gave me the idea of using 4 family funerals to tell the history of one particular family. And then you have to sit with that idea for a long period of time. So when I did that, other ideas began to fasten onto it. So the central thing which gives the book its title is this idea of a promise being made to a black worker that a piece of land with a broken down little house on it would be given to her in exchange for what she did looking after the matriarch of this family in her last illness. Now, that came from an anecdote that another friend told me, and I thought, well, you could stitch that through the 4 funerals, the 4 panels of the book, as it were. And then, you know, characters come, you pick up a thing here and a thing there. They're little fragments and themes, and they gradually build up. But this idea that, a book comes to you as this fully fledged entity is sort of Hollywood. It just doesn't arrive that way.
Yeah. In terms of this particular book and this particular journey, I find that there's a lightness and an exuberance sometimes in your viciousness of cutting people down. But it never seems spiteful to me. It's an incredibly delicate balance. And the one negative thing that I've picked up in some of the overseas scripts is that they worry about the traveling voice. I don't know what else to call it, but die gees van die stuk. The third person, but free-floating, not normal. Also the fact that you don't separate conversations. It's all tied in together, which you constantly feel as if you're dipping in and out of people's minds and their souls and their spirits and circumstances. And I love that. That feels to me incredibly fresh and new in terms of where you're at of writing. How do you feel about the reaction that you get from people as far as that goes?
Well, it's confusing for some people, but I think actually most critics have fastened on that as the biggest virtue of the book, and I'm pleased about that. You know, it sort of came late in the evolution of the book. I got the opportunity to write a couple of drafts of a film script, and I realized that you could transplant the logic of cinema onto the novel. So basically the narrator became a kind of a camera. But maybe a better way to think about the narrator is as a character in the book. You have to think of the narrator as somebody who's there, present, commenting and observing, but also not involved. So that gave me the freedom maybe to poke fun at the characters, to introduce a kind of sardonic tone and some humor into what would otherwise maybe be very, very heavy subject material. So one needs a little distance, and the narrative voice in this case gave me a lot of room to play.
En toekomstige werk, wat wag op die horison?
I'm theoretically working on a collection of short stories at the moment, but instead I'm sitting here talking to you. I'll get back to them soon, but yeah, a collection of short stories is next in the works.
Damon, baie dankie dat jy met ons gesels het. Was heerlik.
Thank you, Marthinus.